Good evening, and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. It's been a few days. I've been off enjoying family and getting a little business done. Tonight I want to take a little bit step back and review some of the basics. And the reason for this is partially the same reason I created this channel. And that is there's just a large gap between the reality of gunshot acoustics and what people are saying about gunshots. And one primary example is Brian Shields. Brian Shields is in my opinion, a great guy, but his understanding of gunshot acoustics is less than zero. And pretty regularly he comes out with these statements based upon something, and then he makes these grandiose leaps of faith and leaves his readers to believe that these leaps of faith are a true representation of what was happening. And generally they are not. In fact, generally they're quite the opposite. And he's published a couple of videos recently that kind of made me really frustrated, because I spend hundreds of hours looking into sounds and analyzing them and trying to put them together and make real conclusions based upon real observations and real analysis and real measurements that people can trust. And he comes along and in 1 minute says something totally contrary to what I've said, without laying any foundation, violating all the laws of physics, and yet he has so many viewers out there believing it. Now, I'm not going to say I want more viewers, because that's not what I want. And I do understand that people tend towards entertainment, and that the stuff I do is really boring. You know, it's just hard work. It's numbers. It's math. It's, repeated measurement after repeated measurement. So anyway, the two videos in question are, the first one that kind of piqued my interest was this one where he goes into essentially claiming that the sounds heard were in no small part related to reamplification by speakers. And he does it through a proxy by a person who is, on record saying that essentially this fellow believes they were real gunshots, and that potentially some of the sounds were heard in Vegas that evening may have come from speakers, which is a perfectly reasonable statement to make. There may have been some sounds in Vegas, but most assuredly they were not the gunshot sounds. And without going into great detail about that, I'll move on to the next video, and I will get into detail on some of the details. The next one that really piqued my curiosity was this one where Brian takes one sound from one video and takes he takes the reaction from one person who looked over their shoulder when they heard a sound, and then he proclaims that he's identified the sniper location somewhere over near the Luxor. And of course he always phrases it in the what's your opinion? So I stated my opinion, and I stated it point blank, and that didn't turn out too well. And the ultimate end is that I'm being called a troll, but that's hither nor thither, and it doesn't bother me. But it pointed out that the motive, and I don't know what Brian's true motive is. Maybe it's just to build his channel up, but I don't believe that he's trying to help people resolve their questions in Vegas, and I don't believe that he's truly trying to educate people as to what the nature of gunshot acoustics is, or where the real shooting locations are. He poses these questions, and to me it looks like he's just creating more speculative disruption and not providing any closure to anyone. From my perspective, that's just the opposite of what I want. I want people to have closure and understanding. I want people to trust research that is well-founded. And most of all, I feel that it's kind of immoral to lead people on. And I think it's kind of immoral when you know that something isn't quite right, or if you don't take the time to do enough research to prove it, that when you just take these one little samples of sound from one video and proclaim that you can make anything of it, because that's far from the truth. I assure you that unless you have specialized equipment, one sound is not going to mean diddly squat. It takes repeated measurements, repeated videos, repeated corroboration, and a lot of math and a lot of calculations to come to any real conclusion about anything. And that's what this channel has done. Thousands of thousands of measurements, hundreds of hours just on gunshot acoustics, and there's still hundreds of hours left. So let's get down to reviewing some of the basics of sounds in a review process, so that I can impart part of my knowledge. Let's talk about what happens when you have a sound. So the most common wild statement that, for example, Brian would make, and other people might make also, is that they heard a gunshot sound. Well, my first natural instinct is, how do you know it's a gunshot sound? Well, it sounds like one. Oh, how do you know what a gunshot sounds like? And they say, well, I'm in the military. Okay, you're in the military, great. Does that mean people who aren't in the military don't know what sounds, or it's just that you have more experience? Well, let's presume you have more experience. What kind of sounds have you been exposed to, and under what conditions? Have you ever been exposed to the conditions that existed in Vegas? Can you make many statement about that? And those are all pretty subjective statements about anything. But, one sound, a sound that has a pop or a snap or a crack or anything like that to it, could be generated by anything. And even with a real gun, if you know that a gun's been fired somewhere, you may not hear the sound. The sound may be loud, it may be soft, whatever. Even if it's far away from you, the sound is so low typically that you cannot really ascertain what the source or cause of that sound is. And so it becomes a very, what shall I say? It's still pretty subjective. Let's just say that when you have one sound and you just rely upon your ears to tell you what it is. So for those people without specialized equipment like ShotSpotter has, where they built, these antennas of sensors, these array of sensors that are at precise known distances from each other with totally synchronized clocks, so that they can measure with high performance sensors, so they can detect sounds down to 1/1,000,000th of a second in duration. You can't really take one sound and say what it is with the commercial recorders that are available to us. You have to have at least 2 or 3 sounds to even begin to do that. But for Brian, when he takes a video, and which video did he take? Let's go back to which video he took. He took, just to provide a little context to what he was saying, he took, if we look on the Vegas shooting map, which I reference, multiple times per day, it is this video up here near that semicircular, I don't know what it is, a booth, vendor booths and all that, and you can get up on top and everything. And there's a fellow in there at the end of this little video, which is pretty short, that he's looking towards the Tropicana area, MGM Tropicana area, and there's a sound that comes along, and he looks over his shoulder back towards the west side of the venue. And so Brian asserts that because he looked back that way, that must be where the bullets were coming from. And he then goes on to conclude that the most likely spot, or at least one spot, is the Sphinx area here. Okay, so this video, and Brian didn't even mention the fact that, which one of these. Anyway, this video contains most of the fourth volley, and it contains 5 of the 6 known single shots that occur between volleys 4 and 5. And the one he makes reference to is what I call the third shot. And for those of you who have been, long-time viewers of this, if you started with me, say 4 months ago, you'll know that I did do an analysis of these shots from multiple videos, 20 or more videos. And while I haven't concluded that analysis, I did give you my opinion of what I might be able to say about that. I did nail down 3 shots, not shot 3, for us, and make some pretty concrete conclusions, but the rest of the shots are still, under investigation. And by doing that, by taking multiple measurements over multiple videos and looking at this, I can say pretty conclusively that every single one of these shots heard, the sound that you hear is the supersonic crack. It's not the muzzle sound. You don't hear that because that muzzle sound is subdued. And that's, one of the very first things you have to ask. When you hear a sound, what is that sound? What are the possibilities of it? And that brings us back to the nature of sounds. Many sounds are like the muzzle blast, which, is emitted by the exploding gases coming out of the barrel of the gun. It kind of spreads out evenly in all directions and forms this sphere that just gets bigger and bigger, and because it gets bigger and bigger, it covers larger and larger areas, and because it does that, the sound becomes softer and softer over distance. And so for any point which is equidistant from that sound source, the delay to the destination will be the same for all equivalent distances. Or put another way, we can draw it, and I don't care what color we draw. So if we have somebody on the ground here and they fire a gun, then the muzzle blast, which is the sound coming out of the barrel, will propagate outward from that point in all directions equally. And so these are equal rings of distance away from that. And I'm only going to draw 3 here. So a person on this third ring, which is 3 units of distance away from the source, let's say right here, will have 3 units of delay, which is simply the distance divided by the speed of sound. And that person, no matter where you're at on the ring, will have the same delay. A person on the first ring will have 1 unit of delay no matter where on the ring you are. So there are multiple positions which record the sound at the same time. But these rings are equally spaced, and if you know either the distance or the time of arrival, you can predict, using very simple math, how far away the shooter is. But, like I just said, you have to know more than one piece of information. So if I just have the sound and I don't know how long it took to get there, or I don't know how far away, then I'm left to say, well, what do I know? I can't tell you what direction it's coming from. So what Brian basically is asserting is that the human being will turn towards the shooter, which is the most, not most, I think I'm being a little overemphasized here. There's more than one type of sound generated by a gun, and the only time you can make that statement is if it's the muzzle blast. And as I just said, none of those shots are the muzzle blast prominent. Only the supersonic crack. Now, in one recording out of the 20, I did record an audible muzzle blast, but it wasn't the video that he was referencing, and it certainly wasn't for that shot. So what does that mean? Brian Shields has taken one sound, which is a supersonic crack, and I know it's a supersonic crack because it's similar to all other supersonic cracks on all other videos for all those 6 rounds that were fired between volleys 4 and 5. And it's similar in nature to all the supersonic cracks that were recorded that evening, and it follows the theory, namely the frequency is about right, the duration is about right, and the timing, well, we'll talk about timing in a little bit. So I can reasonably conclude then that, based upon hundreds of measurements, that the sound that Brian is referring to in that video is very probably a supersonic crack generated by a supersonic projectile. Alright, why is that relevant? Well, if we get back to this, we're talking about the muzzle sounds. Let's talk about some other sounds. Let's talk for a moment about how sounds get to you. Let's say you're in a marching band, and I want to switch to green because you all know that I like green. Let's say I'm in a city and we're doing something like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade or something, and the main thoroughfare which passes Macy's is here along this way, but there are other places where the bands and the floats and everything are staged. And let's say you've got a marching band down here at the south end marked with blue, and the main viewing station is up here around the corner. People up here, if nobody else is making a lot of noise, will hear this band if it is playing down there. And yet there are tall buildings between us. And so in this case, what's happening is the sounds are channeled by the tall buildings down this pathway, and anybody in a direct path will hear them fairly prominently, depending on how far they're away. But the sound bends around this corner and then propagates itself down towards the stand. Now, as it bends around that corner through a process called refraction, it loses some intensity, but the point is that sound bends. And so, without knowing whether or not you're in a line of sight situation, or whether or not you are in a non-line of sight situation, you can't say that with great certainty that looking in the direction of the sound is coming from the actual source, because a person here at the stage would look towards the line of sight down a straight distance, when in fact the sound is coming from a 90-degree angle away from that line of sight and bending around the corner. That's one instance. That's caused by refraction. And this is very prominently what's happening in the foundation room, that there is no direct path for the sound to come from either rooms 134 or 135 to get to the foundation room, and so it has to refract around the building. You can still hear it prominently because it's close enough, but when you start applying line of sight calculations for distance and time, you're going to be wrong. You have to accommodate that time that it takes to refract and the extra distance that it has to travel. So let's go to another type of sound. And I'll get back to the supersonic cracks here eventually, but I want to get the simple cases done. Let's say, for example, that you're on the ground, okay, and somebody fires a weapon, and we're going to talk about, once again, the muzzle blast. So let's just presume that it's what we call a point source, i.e. it can be modeled as a single point of sound, as opposed to a big conglomerate of sounds. So it propagates outward in all directions and eventually reaches the ground where you and I are located, and we can then record or hear it. Alright. But as it does so, it does so in all directions. So if we're out here at X marks the spot, then the direct line of path sound that we would hear as most prominent is likely going to take this path right from the tip of the gun to your ears or to your recorder. That's what we call a direct path, in which case you can, for the muzzle blast, divide that distance of that path over the speed of sound and come up with an estimate of when the sound should reach you. Or if you have two or more recordings for which you've synchronized together, you can determine, let's say we have another recording over here, and the sound obviously will hit it too, but it takes a different path. Let's say you recorded in absolute time, and this one occurred at 0.1 seconds, and this one occurred at 0.3 seconds. And the difference between them is 0.2. You then can apply the alignment. Say this one was first, this one was second, therefore this one is closer. Now that doesn't mean that you can go from the second point to the first and say that the source of the shooter is over there, because it's not. You have to take into account the fact that the paths were different, the delays were different, and that the gun is elevated. Okay, but in these cases where we have a muzzle blast propagating in all directions evenly, you will, as an observer, generally look in the direction of the sound, unless it's not a direct path. These are both direct paths. So let's add in something that's not a direct path. Each of these, of course, there is a secondary sound that you will generally hear and record, and that is when this sound hits the ground, it's going to bounce up. And it's going to do so for both situations, and that's what's called a reflection. It's not a direct path. It involves first hitting the ground and coming up. But depending upon how close you are to the sound, the nature of the ground or the object it's reflecting, which could be the ground, could be a building or other, the intensity of it may be very large, and it may actually be comparable to the first and primary direct path line of sound. So when you hear that reflected sound, you're going to look in the direction of the source, which is you're going to look at the ground, because that's where you're hearing it from, and that points away from where the source of the shooter is. So that's another way that, saying that where the person looks is where the source of the sound is, or where the shooter is wrong. It's where the source of the sound is coming from, which in the case of a reflection is the gun or the ground or the reflecting surface. So only when you have a direct line of sight that's not blocked by anything, and the air temperature is constant, can you assume then that where you look will be somewhat in the area of the source of the sound, or in this case the source of the shooter. And that's what Brian is trying to say. And it fails miserably because it's a supersonic crack. Supersonic cracks don't work that way. And here's what a supersonic crack does. Okay, so I'm going to redraw this picture. And I'm going to put, we're going to take an overhead view as though we're flying. It just makes the whole geometry of the situation a little easier, and we're going to say that you're on the ground. So let's draw a gun somewhere. In fact, let's erase the ground, because the ground is all below us now. And we fire our bullet, and we're going to assume it goes out straight. These are all, major assumptions, but it does make explaining it easy. It goes out. And the bullet is supersonic, therefore it generates a supersonic cone all along the path. Okay. Now, let's assume that we have an observer who is located very close to the bullet path, right here. Doesn't matter how far down it is, as long as the bullet is still supersonic. What that person will hear is the supersonic crack that's generated along the bullet path, and in this case, since they're very, very close, it will be very close to the bullet right there. So that sound, when that person looks, will look towards the bullet path. So if the person was looking at the shooter originally, they will turn away from that and look towards the bullet path, almost at a 90-degree angle. And that's true for anybody who's at a reasonable distance away from the gun, but very close to the bullet path. So they will look 90 degrees away. Now let's apply that to Brian's observation. Let's go one step further before we do that. Now, if we have an observer who's way away from the bullet, then the sound we hear from the supersonic crack is closer to the bullet. It could be over here somewhere. And in that case, we would turn and look to the bullet, which might look kind of close to the shooter. But if we were somewhere in between and the supersonic crack was generated there, we would look differently. And so basically, the further out you are, the closer you are to estimating the shooter's position, and the closer to the bullet you are, the less you're going to estimate it. Alright, so in the situation that Brian has said, first we observe that it's a supersonic crack. So you can't just make these simple assumptions that where you look is the source of the shooter. So let's draw a crude representation. We have the Luxor over here. And we have the Tropicana up this way at the top. We have the Mandalay Bay somewhere down towards the bottom and on the west side here. And then we have approximately the place at which this event occurred right there. And the guy is kind of looking up this way towards the Tropicana. And then he looks over the top, or the left of his shoulder, left or right or whatever it is, and he looks kind of west back this way. Okay? So, since we heard a supersonic crack, where is it coming from? Well, Brian's going to say that the shooter is somewhere here. No, the source of the supersonic crack is somewhere there. So, the bullet path may have came from down that way. It may have come from down this way. It actually may have come from up there. But it's not going to be from there. And let me make that a little bit clearer. And we'll take the forward-looking direction. If we had a sniper over here at the Luxor, and if they fired a bullet, and if it, there's a lot of ifs here, you see, and you have to know, and if it went in our direction, and we heard it and it was loud, and we were right here. That's not a good, let's make it more realistic. Let's make it, and we were right here. Come on, Richard, you can do it. Okay, then the supersonic crack, if we were close to the bullet path, would have been generated right here, and we would look this way. Okay? If the path of the bullet was more like this, and in that case, you would have to say that the supersonic, well, crack would be probably, this is a rough estimate, you can't really do this by hand, but I'm trying, there, then we would have looked this way. But the only time it would actually point back to the source of the shooter is if the bullet was way off, let's say like this. Now that's the wrong color. If the bullet path went this way, in which case our observation would be down this way and be closer and closer. But in the case where the bullet is so far away, the crack reduces pretty substantially. And that crack was kind of in the middle. You know, they weren't on top of it, they weren't real far away. So it's probably more something like this. Now, adding to the complexity is the fact that you can't tell, because the supersonic crack is generated symmetrically about the path of the bullet, you can't tell whether it came from there or there. So that adds to the complexity. So Brian has to know at least 2 or 3 more data points before he can make any prediction about this thing. And what he's done is applied the physics of a muzzle blast, which don't apply in this case. And now we'll take and state that in a different way. Let's get the pyramid back in there first. And let's run an example from the Mandalay Bay. If the shooting occurred at the Mandalay Bay and was going in the general direction of the center of the venue, which is where I believe most of the bullets went, and where the data suggests very intensely that they went, and your recording position was here, where would you look? Well, remember, the guy was looking this direction. Okay, well, the supersonic crack, since you're not on top of the bullet, is going to be somewhere along this path and maybe back here. So naturally, he's going to turn nearly 180 degrees and look in the opposite direction, which is more or less where he looked. Maybe not, quite exactly, but as you can see, it's the, and even then, it won't be at the Mandalay Bay. It'll look somewhere off to either to that side or this side. So you got a problem here in trying to figure out. But just like when you look at a jet going by the time you hear the sonic boom, the jet has already gone much, much further ahead. And when you look at it, you don't see the jet. You have to kind of scan right or left, depending upon which way the jet is going, or if it's going directly away from you. That's easy to do. But if it's going left to right and you hear a sonic boom, then you have to look right to see where the jet is by the time you hear the sonic boom. It's the same principle that gets applied to these bullets. So, now what are the other complications with the statements that Brian makes? Well, he could have said this. If he had said this, and this would have been a good statement. He could have said, I've got an observer here, and I hear a sound, and I've measured recordings here, 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 and here, and they all hear that sound. So it must be something real. It's not a sound that's isolated to that one place. And he says, it looks like gunshots because I've looked at all the other gunshots and it sounds very similar, which is kind of flaky, but it does work. And then he could have said, okay, so then I measured when the sound occurred. I lined those videos up, so he could select anything that occurred in the same time, all those videos at the same time visually. And then he could have said, which place did I hear the sound come from first? And if he had said, well, I have it and it's coming from here first, and here it gets second, then he would have to apply the physics of the supersonic crack. You see, and so at that point, you have to know the physics of the supersonic crack, state them, estimate the elevation, the path, and the whole 9 yards before you can even predict which one of these places is going to get the sound first. If this had been the muzzle blast, it would have been trivial. If it had been the muzzle blast, because the muzzle blast propagates out in all directions equally, then this would have been approximately, the direction of the sound, and the shooter would be localized up there. And that's really what he's saying, is that because he took that one sound and they turned right, then he can predict it's over there. But that only works roughly for the muzzle blast. And even then, you have to have 2 measurements. And that's what I'm objecting to, the lack of rigor in his approach and jumping at a conclusion which probably doesn't make sense. Now, don't get me wrong, he could get lucky. He could get lucky on occasion. But generally, based upon all the research I've done, I don't believe that there was a sniper inside the eye of the Sphinx. And I have yet to publish my exact results on the location because they're still underway. I'm still trying to align enough videos to get enough points and then apply the physics of the supersonic crack, which means I have to know elevation, speed of sound, speed of the bullet, all miss distance, all of those things, which we can't know absolutely, but we can kind of estimate and then run through all the various models and see which one is closest. And that's what I'm doing. And that takes just a tremendous amount of diligence, rigor, and work. So that's my main bitch with the type of approach that Brian and Hoover and some of the other people are using. They're trying to jump in with one conclusion, with bad assumptions, with no theory whatsoever. I mean, Brian didn't even state the theory here. He's assuming that all sounds travel the same. And let's get back to sounds, because there's just a tremendous amount of sound, different ways that sounds can be propagated. We talked about the spherical nature of the muzzle blast, where it, kind of propagates out in all directions. And that's not a spiral, but you get the idea. It's easy to draw concentric circles that way. Or we can talk about a speaker. Let's talk about a voice coil speaker. We're all familiar with the voice coil speaker because we all have them in many everyday applications. If you have a speaker on the stage, for example, and it's emitting sound, it's much, much louder in the front of it than it is behind it. So it's kind of a directional sound. It doesn't propagate with equal intensity in all directions. And then in reality, the muzzle blast is that way too, because those locations behind the shooter are much less intense than those in front of. In fact, it forms, if you looked in the intensity graph, it would be, for a muzzle blast, it would be kind of like this. Like that, with the greatest intensity occurring in front, a couple of lobes out to the sides at about 30 degrees, if I recall correctly, and then a big kind of spherical object behind. But for any substantial distance away from the gun, we can model it as in equal intensity. So back to the speaker, though. So on the stage, we've got this sound, and it propagates out like that. So it's kind of directional. And then, as you recall, the higher the frequency, the more directional the sound is. That is, a 200 hertz signal, being a big, long wavelength, will easily bend around objects through refraction. Whereas let's say a 4 kilohertz signal, which is real high pitched, is very directional and doesn't refract around large objects. It gets blocked by them. And a person is big enough to block a 4 kilohertz signal. A person is not big enough to block a 200 hertz signal. So the speaker is kind of directional. But at large distances, it kind of looks like a equal spherical propagation. So what about this speaker? Let's just stick to the simple stuff. I'll talk about the speaker in another way another time. So we covered, in some instances, sound can be generated as though it were a linear wave. If we have, let's say, a 20-foot long, 3-foot high wall, and we push that wall at 60 hertz straight out, then there's a big pressure in front of it that goes straight out, and for the most part it propagates directly and linearly out in the direction that we pushed. And then there's some aberrations along the edges, because along the edges refraction takes over and generates once again these essentially point modeled curves out. And the further it goes out, the bigger those curves get, until the curves dominate and the whole thing looks like a sphere then. But reasonably close to that big wall, then the sound is going to be linearly propagated straight out, not in a circle, not in a cone, but straight out. And that would be a similar or analogous type thing would be you drop a log in a pond of water and you see the ripples go straight out from the long part and kind of in circles at the ends. So that's another way sound can propagate. Let's talk about the actual cone that's produced by the supersonic projectile. And once again, if we have this bullet going, left to right, then there's a cone, the supersonic cone around the projectile that's being generated, and the direction of propagation for the edges of that cone is the perpendicular to the edges. So this line right there represents the propagation of that side of the cone, and on the opposite side there's an equally that way. So the cone is propagating in two directions at once, or actually it's just propagating in all directions as a circle if you cut a plane section through the cone. But along the edges of that cone, it's kind of like the log. It kind of is propagating outwards in a linear direction. But since that bullet is traveling fast, that cone is getting bigger and bigger at its edges. So the closer you are to the source of the sound, the bigger the cone is. But anybody who is parallel to that propagating wave at the same distance is going to hear it at the same time, regardless of how close they are to the source, as long as you're parallel to that cone. And in fact, let's talk about something else about that. If you think about this in a logical sense, the bullet is traveling, let's say Mach 3, or let's say 3,000 feet per second. That's how fast the bullet's traveling. So, and let's presume that we are 1,000 feet away. Then it's only going to take 1/3 of a second for the bullet to reach us. And since the bullet is producing the supersonic cone along the entire direction, it too will hear the supersonic crack out here, if we're close, in 1/3 of a second. Sound, on the other hand, from the muzzle is propagating at the speed of sound, which is approximately 1,000, approximately. So it would take a full second. So for the muzzle blast, it's going to take a whole second, 1.0 second, to get to us. And then, the difference between those two is what we call the lag. And in the Ryan Shields case, we didn't have any lag because you can't hear the muzzle blast. Another indication that it's a supersonic crack and not the muzzle. Otherwise, you have to explain where the muzzle blast went, or where the supersonic crack went, which in the case of the down the hall shots, that's precisely what happened. You don't hear the supersonic crack because the bullet wasn't coming in our direction. It was going down the hall, and all we hear are the muzzle waves that escaped out the window. And because they're recessed in the room absorbs a vast quantity of the energy associated with the muzzle discharge. And a portion of it came out the window, but not a large portion compared to the overall energy expended by each round. And that's why it's muffled. That's why it can't be heard everywhere, because the gun's not right at the edge of the window, shooting almost 50% or more of its energy out the window. What do we hear at the foundation room? What we hear at the foundation room is both a crack and a muzzle blast. But because they're behind the shooter and they refract around, both the crack and the muzzles arrive at the same time. So the ear picks up one sound for the refractive path, and then it hears all this other confusion due to secondary reflections off of walls and buildings. And so it kind of gets mixed up and confused. But it's still enough there that we can almost count with the ear how many shots there are. But from a real analysis portion, it's very easy to see that there is both the supersonic crack and the muzzle. And so when you're making measurements, you have to isolate out the muzzle blast to make any real measurements and predictions about when the sound arrived versus the speed of sound, because if you do just the supersonic crack, you have to know the position of the shooter, the position of you, the trajectory of the bullet, the elevation, all those things before you can make realistic prediction. And that's why doing stuff just based off of supersonic cracks is so tough. If you throw a supersonic crack together with a muzzle blast, then things become so much easier. All right, where does that leave us? Well, I bitched enough about Brian probably, so I'm going to leave the LAPD speaker thing for another time. But this is the nature of the stuff you have to go through to make realistic statements about where the source of a sound, or where the source of a shooter, more importantly, is. And time after time I see people not even wanting to pay attention to the real physics of it. And it makes me sad. It makes me a little bit, frustrated at times. And I want the viewers of this to know that while I'm frustrated and sad, there isn't anything I can do about, whether other people want to have a true understanding or whether they just want to promote their channel. And I think that's a lot of it. I think that Brian and Johnny want to get notoriety and promote their channel. And it's sad to me to see people being led down that path, just plain sad. That's not to say that they don't add some value, although I'm still trying to figure out what, but it's just sad. All right, so where does that leave us? Let me see if I really thought about this carefully enough to leave a good impression. This is kind of an off-the-cuff little rant, really. What can we tell just from one sound? Can we really tell anything from one sound? I don't think so with the ear, really, because one sound is just not enough to know unless you have a whole bunch of context. I mean, if you know that a shot actually occurred, you first have to say, well, is the sound I hear in the right proximity to the sound to have been generated by the gun or whatever it is you're measuring? So that requires some contextual information, and it requires some assumptions. You have to look at the nature of the recording device. One other important thing as it relates to the Brian observation. To me, just with my ears, that sounds more like a strike than it does. That particular shot 3, sounds more like a strike than a supersonic crack. Now, when I get into Sonic Visualizer and I look at the frequency and the duration and everything, I can conclude that it's a supersonic crack. But if I were to just listen to it without any other tool, I would say, well, a bullet hit something. And so, once again, you have to separate it out. What is that sound? Is it a bullet strike? Is it a reflection? Is it a refraction? Is it a direct path muzzle? Is it a supersonic crack? Is it a gall darn firecracker? Is it a rock hitting the window? Because in that video alone, there are many sounds which sound very similar to the ear that are nothing more than people banging against other stuff. And so, I think it's sloppy work to conclude. So in this case, I think Brian, he already, knows by looking at all the other videos and looking at the Las Vegas shooting archive that there's a probable gunshot in that location and that it's confirmed by many other videos. But it's very, very weak to say that, oof, this is a gunshot. And even Las Vegas shooting archive doesn't distinguish between muzzle and sonic, or the shockwave, which you have to do to make any statement about the position of the shooter. And for the supersonic cracks, you better be prepared to bring out some math, because I'm going to hop on every statement that Brian or anybody else that makes where it's very, very clear that they're not giving you, me, or their readers enough information to basically believe or rely upon what they're saying. Okay, let's wrap it up for tonight. Let's leave it there before I get into real ranting. All right, we'll catch you in the next one. We'll talk more about where I'm at in terms of establishing absolute timelines for some of these videos. Have a good evening, and catch you on the next one.